For those of you who know Dr. Elizabeth Colton, she goes by Liz. She is a diplomat and journalist in residence at Warren Wilson College, a professor of diplomacy for UNITAR and partner international universities. I mean, you can just see it, they're board member at the core Bacon House Foreign Affairs and Diplomacy Organizations and former board member of Public Diplomacy Council in Washington. She's a former Foreign Service officer and UN development planner, board chair, reporters for Sans Frontiers, RSF USA in North America, and last but certainly not least, an award-winning journalist and diplomatic correspondent. I mean, and has been since we started pulling this conference together, just the staunch supporter, like many of you, of this initiative. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Liz Colton.
Thank you so much, LaDonna and everybody, and the ambassador. To follow him is such an honor, and I was in fact worried that maybe I would not be able to segue completely, but actually it's a very perfect segue from everything Ambassador Gifford talked about the human aspect of protocol. And I think most all of us here today at this conference really believe in that. It's something very special that we need to keep in mind. I'd like to start with a couple of things related to that. First of all, my own background, as you mentioned, was as a journalist, but also I've been a diplomat. So I've done these things in different times in my life. I feel they sort of ultimately overlapped. I didn't think they were in conflict with each other. But in each role, in each position, I had different roles. And so as a journalist, but then later as a diplomat, especially as a journalist, I covered from all directions diplomacy and wars and peace. And I saw protocol in action in all of these, from the bottom up at high-level meetings, of course, at times of peace and peace treaties, very high-level protocol. But what I want to mention at the very beginning is that in the wars that I covered, and I was a frontline correspondent, war correspondent, I preferred being a diplomatic correspondent and was always working for that. But at any rate, what I remember the most from my times covering wars, after bombs had fallen or after armies had been routed and soldiers were deserting, what do I remember? I remember that in every case, there were always signs of humans offering, which in fact was a kind of interior, primeval idea of protocol, of offering food and returning food of some kind. Once I was in the Desert Storm War, actually. There were soldiers deserting. Some journalists that I was with that day, we were covering, the Italian cameraman and a Spanish photographer, and I as a radio reporter. What did we see? We offered water to the soldiers, the deserting soldiers that we were interviewing and saying, why did you desert? And what did they do? They pulled dusty dates, the dates out of their pockets and gave them to us. And of course, there was this sense, and I believe this is protocol, that we knew we had to accept, even though really we felt bad because it was kind of like their last piece of food and we didn't have much food with us. But the fact was there was the reciprocity in giving the water, giving back the date. After a bombing where I had been covering another war, and in the morning, the people in the hotel went around passing warm water to warm sort of Kool-Aid drinks to the journalists who were in the hotel and apologizing that the electricity was off after their country had been bombed. And so I just point these out, that these are my memories, and they showed truly always the humanity and the protocol aspect of this. And so I want to begin by talking about what I think, and I'm a social anthropologist, by the way, an anthropologist in academic training, but I believe, and we've talked a lot earlier today about the history of protocol going back to the Egyptians and long before, and the Greeks. But I want to say that I believe that diplomacy and then protocol, which was established almost at the same time as diplomacy, was maybe the beginning of humanity as an action, as behavior. What happened? People sent messengers to another group of people to reach out. They sent dancers, they sent athletes. They finally tried to share food, and eventually they could share food, and eventually they might intermarry. And this was the beginning of humanity. And at the same time, these diplomatic actions were taking place, the early humans were beginning to establish protocol. Okay, how do you give a gift? How do you go to this other place? How do you behave? How do you behave when they come, the strangers come? So I think that we should think of it as long before history, that we are talking about human behavior that's really diplomacy, along with protocol, actually built humanity. And I think that's very exciting. Another thing about that, the very beginning, is the idea of globalization. And the title of my talk, which I'm going to emphasize, is that protocol is the foundation of public diplomacy, and which is all kinds of diplomacy that's in public in any ways. Often we think of it with the media, but it's much more than that, including cultural diplomacy, and also global diplomacy, which is the idea that the local affects the global, and the global has an effect on the local. Nowadays, people are saying, oh yes, this is happening more and more today, globalization. But again, I would suggest that our earliest human forebears, long before history, globalization was what was happening when one little group went out into the world to another group. And so there was back and forth this way. And I would like to add, in speaking about global, G-L-O-C-C-A-L, that I am very excited because of this conference. It turned out that one of the organizers, Dr. Nicoletta Hosso, who founded World Protocol magazine, she's actually written about global, G-L-O-C-A-L, protocol, and I've written and spoken about, we both have in our ways, about global diplomacy as something, a kind of citizen diplomacy. So that's an exciting thing that's happened. So my point is that protocol, and I think what was wonderful about Ambassador Gifford's talk is he wasn't just talking high level. Of course, that's his business as chief of protocol for the United States, chief of US protocol. He's dealing at very high levels, but he sees it also as at all levels. It's not just a high level. It permeates behavior and diplomatic actions. And so I'm going to give just a couple of examples about different kinds. One is I'm going to talk about global diplomacy, that we have evidence now. There are many people who have even, and we can say, if you're practicing global diplomacy, you are often a citizen diplomat. You're not working for a country or a NGO or an international organization. You may be working as an individual citizen. And we have seen that many citizen diplomats have actually gone on to win. I don't think they intended it. They didn't know it would happen, but they became Nobel Peace Prize laureates. And one example I'm going to quickly give to remind you, you may know about, Jody Williams, who in 1997 was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. And as many of you know, what had happened was she had been in Central America. She'd working in humanitarian work in the 1980s, and she observed how terrible landmines are. And anybody who's living in countries, or in my case, where I covered wars, you know it's terrible. She started a campaign that was from her own kitchen when she came back home to Vermont in New England. And she started a campaign from her kitchen, writing letters, writing articles, trying to get a big following about banning landmines. But what was most interesting about the way she worked, which was highly successful, she built over 1,000 of these international campaign to ban landmine committees, but she did it by she worked with the UN and international organizations. She followed the protocol. The protocol being the procedure for leading up to a treaty. So I think it's very important to think she wasn't just out there working. She was still working as an individual initially and as a citizen of the world. And then she worked to follow procedure for how do you get a world treaty? Well, she did. And then she won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. She and her International Committee to Ban Landmines in 1997. So I think that's a great example of globalization and global diplomacy, but that it actually followed world protocol to achieve the treaty. The other example I'm just going to give quickly is and Ambassador Gifford referred to this, the importance of the face-to-face. You know, I teach for the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and I teach students all over the world public diplomacy, and often, and I teach elsewhere at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. I teach a lot of places, but often nowadays, as many of you know, people think that, oh, public diplomacy, if it's with the media, it's just the social media. And I think we need to remember, Ambassador Gifford mentioned it, others earlier today talked about, it's the human connection. So I'm just going to tell you a quick story. I was working in a country, actually in Sudan, and I was the head of public affairs at the American Embassy. And we got word in the morning that there had been, overnight, because it had happened the day before overnight for us in Sudan, that there was, that the US, some employees of the US had committed a kind of a terrible atrocity of a desecration of texts of the Quran. And we knew that we had to issue a statement, and we were preparing to issue statements. We found that the Secretary of State had actually issued a statement in which she, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, had made a statement condemning this action. So we had this. Suddenly, at the same time, while we're preparing this to send out to the media, like a press release, we hear that there are many protesters coming across the Nile toward the American Embassy, protesters and demonstrators who were protesting this action. And I thought to myself, you know, first of all, as if you're in an embassy, you're the guest in the country. I mean, you have diplomatic immunity, so to speak, but you also know that you are the guest, and that is where protocol comes in. So I went to the charge d'affaires and I said, I think that why don't we welcome the leaders, and that's very sort of kind of protocol to welcome the leaders to come in and talk with them about their grievances, the protests, and to show them this statement from our own foreign minister. And that is what happened. Instead of closing the door to these protesters, we welcomed all of them and brought in the leaders of the protest who came from the Islamic University across the river. And they came in, we met together, they spoke of their concerns. I said, you'll be amazed to know that we completely agree with you. And I have a statement here from our Secretary of State, our Foreign Minister, and then we proceeded in a very diplomatic way, basically following protocol of receiving guests, of hearing their complaints, of receiving their messages, and then speaking. Fortunately, we were able to support them and say, we agree with you. And we gave them the copies. We, at that very point, because of this, instead of the demonstration erupting in violence, we actually established relations with the university, and later were able to meet with them for different kinds of educational discussions and exchange. So my point is, you never heard of that situation. It's not in the movies. Why? Because it ended very peacefully. And I'm proud to say it was a great diplomatic protocol achievement. And instead of having violence because of demonstrators coming to an embassy. So what I would like to say is that when we think of whether it's, and we also issued press releases, and they also, so we had public diplomacy, but we also had the face-to-face public diplomacy as well as media releases. It's very important, and we don't have time to go through, but my big emphasis is that we need to think of protocol is the foundation, not only of just high-level diplomacy, but it's the foundation for all kinds of diplomacy, public diplomacy, global diplomacy. It is, as many of you have read and we've all learned, the meaning of the original meaning of the word protocol from the ancient Greek means first glue, as in pages, I would guess papyrus pages. And the first glue, I believe, protocol is still the first glue of society, of human beings, of diplomacy. So thank you very much.